The hum of the airplane engines droned in the background as passengers shifted in their seats, glancing impatiently at their watches. Among them was Grace, a single mother traveling with her bright-eyed daughter, Emily. With a coloring book and endless questions, Emily tried her best to stay entertained. But Grace couldn't help noticing the tension growing in the cabin. It was a flight like any other, delayed, uncomfortable, and ordinary. That was until a frail, older man named Walter boarded the plane, dragging a heavy carry-on bag behind him. His slow, labored steps caught Grace's attention, but it wasn't sympathy she felt first, it was curiosity. Something about him, a weight in his expression, suggested he carried more than just his luggage. The story turns unexpectedly when Walter's bag accidentally brushes against an impeccably dressed businessman, Ethan, seated near the front. The disdain in Ethan's voice as he snapped at Walter sent a ripple of discomfort through the cabin. Passengers averted their eyes, unwilling to intervene. Grace's heart clenched at the injustice. Who was this man, and what had he endured to be met with such cruelty? This seemingly ordinary flight was about to become extraordinary. Hidden behind the layers of frustration, impatience, and judgment lay a tale waiting to be uncovered. A story of bravery, sacrifice, and the unbreakable bonds that defy time. Grace didn't know it yet, but the connection she would soon discover would change not just her life but the lives of everyone on that plane. What secrets does Walter carry? How will Grace's courage transform this moment into something unforgettable? And what does fate have in store for these unlikely travelers? Stay tuned for this powerful journey's twists, revelations, and emotional depth. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for heartfelt stories like this, tales that inspire, remind, and heal. Together, let's explore the beauty of human connection. Walter shuffled down the narrow aisle, his frail hands gripping the handle of his carry-on bag tightly. The weight of it seemed far beyond his capacity, yet he persevered. Grace watched, her maternal instincts stirring as she noticed his slightly trembling frame and the limp in his gait. Emily, always observant, tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, why is that man strolling?" she asked, her soft voice filled with genuine concern. Grace whispered, "He might be tired, sweetheart. Let's see if he needs help." But before she could act, Walter's bag brushed against Ethan, the sharply dressed businessman seated near the front. His voice sliced through the murmurs of the cabin like a whip. "Watch where you're going." Ethan snapped, his piercing glare fixed on Walter. "Do you even know what you're doing?" The older man froze, mumbling an apology as his face flushed with embarrassment. The cabin seemed to hold its breath collectively, but no one said anything. Grace clenched her fists. Her gaze darted to the other passengers, most of whom averted their eyes, clearly unwilling to get involved. Walter reached his assigned seat near the back of the plane, where he struggled to hoist his bag into the overhead compartment. His frail arms shook as he tried again and again. Grace felt her chest tighten. Why wasn't anyone helping him? Suddenly, the bag slipped from Walter's grasp, narrowly missing Ethan, who had stood to retrieve his laptop from the compartment below. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan bellowed, his face contorted with fury. "Are you trying to kill someone with that bag?" Walter stammered another apology, his hands trembling now, not just from exertion but from the weight of the humiliation. Grace's face burned with anger as she glanced around the cabin. Discomfort was etched on every face, yet still, no one moved. It was as if they were waiting for someone else to intervene. Emily leaned in closer to her mother, her voice a hesitant whisper. "Why is that man yelling at him, Mommy?" Grace took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm for Emily's sake. Sometimes people forget to be kind. "Sweetheart," but even as she said it, she felt the words boiling inside her. Something had to be done. Grace unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her voice steady but firm. "That's enough." The cabin grew deathly quiet. All eyes turned toward her as she addressed Ethan directly. "This man deserves respect, not your insults. Do you even know what he's been through?" Ethan scoffed, his annoyance clear. "And who do you think you are to lecture me? This is none of your business." Grace squared her shoulders, meeting his gaze without flinching. "It becomes everyone's business when someone is being mistreated. This man has done nothing to deserve your scorn." She turned to Walter, her voice softening. Sir, do you need help with your bag? Walter's eyes widened in surprise, his lips trembling. Thank you, ma'am. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. Grace quickly lifted the bag, securing it in the overhead compartment as murmurs of approval rippled through the cabin. Ethan, however, remained indignant. You people, he muttered, loud enough for those around him to hear, always playing the hero. Before Grace could respond, a man across the aisle spoke up. She's right. Show some respect. A woman in the row ahead chimed in. You should be ashamed of yourself. The flight attendant arrived just then, her tone polite but firm. Sir, please take your seat and keep your voice down. We need to maintain a respectful atmosphere for all passengers. Ethan glared at the attendant but said nothing more, sinking into his seat with a huff. Grace guided Walter to her and Emily's row. You can sit with us, she offered. We'd be honored, but where will you sit? Walter asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace smiled at Emily. My daughter can sit on my lap. We'll manage just fine. Emily, catching the gravity of the moment, nodded thoughtfully. It's okay, Mr. Walter. You can have my seat. Walter hesitated, but the gratitude in his eyes was unmistakable. With the flight attendant's help, he settled into the seat next to Grace, visibly more comfortable. Grace noticed Ethan shooting her icy glares as the plane prepared for takeoff. She ignored him, focusing on Emily, who was now coloring quietly. But she couldn't shake the tension in the air. It wasn't just Ethan's behavior that troubled her. It was the collective silence that had preceded it. Walter leaned toward Grace, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you, ma'am. I don't know what I would have done without your kindness. Grace smiled, placing a hand lightly on his arm. You don't have to thank me. It's the least I can do. The plane began its ascent, the tension in the cabin slowly easing. But Grace knew this was only the beginning of the story. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about Walter, something she was meant to understand. And as she glanced at the military insignia on his worn hat, she felt a surge of curiosity. Who was Walter? What was his story? Little did she know, the answer would reshape everything she thought she knew about her family. As the plane leveled out, Grace noticed Walter fidgeting with his hat, a military cap that had seen better days. The faded logo caught her attention, sparking admiration and curiosity. That's a unique hat, she said gently, hoping to make conversation. Were you in the military? Walter looked at her with a small, wistful smile. Yes, ma'am. I served many years ago, during World War II and later in Korea. Those were different times. Emily's ears perked up. You fought in wars? She asked, her wide eyes filled with innocent wonder. Walter nodded slowly, his gaze growing distant. I did, young lady. It was a time of great courage and great loss. We were all so young back then, barely more than boys. Grace leaned closer, her interest deepening. Did you see combat? She asked softly, unsure if the question would bring back painful memories. Walter took a deep breath, his expression clouding with sorrow. More than I care to remember. But some moments stand out, the ones that stay with you forever. Like the ambush in Korea. My best friend, Jack, and I were side by side, trying to fight our way out. Emily's voice, soft and curious, interrupted his thoughts. What happened to Jack? Walter hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as they rested on the photo album peeking out of his carry-on bag. Jack, he saved my life. Pulled me out of the line of fire. But he didn't make it. A heavy silence fell over their small corner of the plane. Grace felt her heart tighten at the raw pain in Walter's voice. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He must have been a remarkable man. Walter nodded, his lips pressed into a thin line. He was the best man I ever knew. I owe him everything. Emily, ever curious, pointed to the photo album. Mr. Walter, what's in there? Walter smiled faintly, his hands moving to open the worn cover. Memories, he said, his voice tinged with pride and sorrow. Would you like to see? Grace and Emily leaned in as Walter carefully turned the pages. Black and white photographs filled the album, each a window into a world long past. Walter paused at a particular photo, his finger tracing the image of two young soldiers standing side by side. "That's me," he said, pointing to his younger version. "And this is Jack." Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something familiar about the man named Jack, a resemblance she couldn't place but felt deep in her bones. The more she stared, the more a memory from her childhood surfaced. "My grandfather," she murmured, her voice trembling. "He looked just like this. My mother used to tell me stories about him. How he was a hero in the war but never came home." Walter turned to her, his eyes widening in shock. "Your grandfather? What was his name?" "Jack," Grace whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Jack Thompson." Walter's hand flew to his mouth, his face pale with disbelief. "Jack Thompson, that's him. Your grandfather saved my life." The plane hit a slight patch of turbulence, jolting everyone back to the present. Emily clung to Grace, her small hands gripping her mother's arm. Walter reached out, patting Emily's hand gently. "It's okay, little one. Just a bump in the road," he said with a reassuring smile. Grace struggled to process what she had just learned as the turbulence passed. The man sitting next to her wasn't just a stranger. He was a living link to her family's past, a witness to her grandfather's bravery and sacrifice. "I never knew the full story," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "My mother always said he was a hero, but she didn't know the details. He died before she was old enough to understand." Walter nodded, his gaze distant as he recalled the fateful day. "Your grandfather was the bravest man I ever knew. He could have saved himself during that ambush in Korea, but he stayed to help me. He pulled me to safety, even though it cost him his life." Tears streamed down Grace's face as she listened. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for telling me. And thank you for being here, for letting us know what he did." Walter reached out, placing his hand over hers. "It's me who owes thanks, Grace. If not for Jack, I wouldn't be here today." Sensing the moment's gravity, Emil nestled closer to her mother. "Mommy, was Grandpa Jack a hero?" she asked softly. Grace kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Yes, sweetheart. He was a hero. And now we know how much he meant to the people around him." Walter smiled at Emily, his voice gentle. "Your great-grandpa was the man who made the world a better place. You should be very proud." The flight passed in a blur of stories and shared memories. Walter told Grace and Emily about the days he and Jack had spent together, the bonds they had formed, and the sacrifices they had made. Grace listened intently, soaking in every detail, feeling as though she was finally getting to know a part of her family that had always been a mystery. Grace felt a newfound sense of purpose as the plane began its descent. She glanced at Walter, her heart swelling with gratitude. This wasn't just a chance meeting, it was fate. And she knew she couldn't let the connection end here. Once the plane landed, Grace turned to Walter, her voice filled with quiet determination. "Mr. Walter, would you come with us? There's someone you need to meet." Walter looked at her curiously. "Who?" Grace smiled, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "My father, your best friend's son. I think he'd love to meet you." Grace helped Walter down the narrow airplane aisle, her heart pounding with anticipation. Emily, still clutching her coloring book, looked up at Walter with wide-eyed admiration, as if he were a character from one of her stories come to life. The trio moved through the terminal, and the bustling energy around them starkly contrasted with the quiet tension in Grace's chest. Grace guided Walter into her car as they reached the curb, ensuring he was comfortable in the passenger seat while Emily buckled herself in the back. The drive through the suburbs was filled with quiet reflections, broken occasionally by Emily's innocent questions. "Mommy, do you think Grandpa Jack would like Mr. Walter?" Emily asked. Grace smiled at her daughter in the rearview mirror. "I think he would, sweetheart. I think they'd be great friends." Walter chuckled softly, his voice tinged with gratitude. "Your daughter has a way of making people feel special, Grace." Grace nodded, her gaze flicking to the road ahead. "She gets it from her grandfather, I think." They arrived at Grace's childhood home, a modest, warmly lit house surrounded by a well-kept garden. Grace's father, David, was on the porch, sipping tea and watching the sunset. He stood as the car pulled into the driveway, his expression a mixture of curiosity and surprise. "Dad," Grace called as she helped Walter out of the car. "There's someone I want you to meet." David stepped forward, his brow furrowed slightly. His eyes shifted from Grace to Walter, then widened in disbelief. "Is that?" Walter, leaning on his cane, took a few careful steps forward. "David," he said, his voice trembling, "your father saved my life, and it's an honor to meet his son finally." David froze, his tea forgotten, and time seemed to stand still for a moment. Then, without a word, he crossed the distance and embraced Walter, his voice breaking. "I've heard so much about you. My father always said you were like a brother to him." The two men stood there, holding each other as though bridging decades of loss and memory. Grace watched, tears streaming down her face as Emily tugged at her sleeve. "Mommy, why are you crying?" Grace knelt, hugging Emily tightly. "Because this is an extraordinary moment, sweetheart. This is family." Inside the house, Grace prepared tea as Walter and David sat together, sharing stories about Jack. David brought out an old photo album, his hands shaking slightly as he turned the pages. As he pointed to a faded photograph, Walter's face lit up with recognition. "That's Jack and me," Walter said, his voice soft. "This was taken just before the ambush. He always had a way of making us laugh, even in the darkest moments." David nodded, his voice filled with emotion. "He wrote to us about you. Said you were the bravest man he'd ever met." Walter shook his head. "Your father was the brave one. I wouldn't be here without him." The room was filled with quiet reflections, each person lost in their thoughts. Emily broke the silence, pointing to a picture of Jack in uniform. "He looked strong," she said, her voice filled with awe. "Like a superhero." Walter smiled, reaching out to pat Emily's hand. "He was a little one." He truly was. As the evening wore on, David excused himself briefly, returning moments later with something clutched tightly, a box covered in worn leather. He placed it on the table, his expression solemn. "I think this belongs to you," David said, sliding the box toward Walter. Walter opened it slowly, revealing a collection of medals and a neatly folded letter. His hands trembled as he picked up the letter, recognizing Jack's handwriting. The room fell silent as he read aloud. "To my family, if you're reading this, it means I didn't make it home. But please know I didn't go alone. I was with Walter, my brother in arms, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. He is the reason I found courage in my darkest hours. I hope he finds peace and you'll welcome him as you would me. Love always, Jack." Walter's voice cracked as he finished the letter, tears streaming down his face. "He always thought of others," he murmured, clutching the letter. Grace wiped her tears, her heart swelling with sorrow and pride. "He'd be so proud of both of you," she said softly. David nodded, placing a comforting hand on Walter's shoulder. "He's right here with us, in every story, every memory." Emily climbed into Walter's lap, hugging him tightly. "You're part of our family now, Mr. Walter." Walter smiled through his tears, holding Emily close. "Thank you, little one. That means more than you know." The night stretched on with more stories, laughter, and tears. Walter and David bonded over their shared connection to Jack, while Grace felt a profound fulfillment. This was more than just a reunion. It was a healing of old wounds, a mending of hearts that had long carried the weight of loss. As the clock struck midnight, David spoke up, his voice firm yet tender. "Walter, you found your way to us, and I think it's time you stayed. We'd love to have you here as part of our family." Walter hesitated, his eyes searching each face in the room. Finally, he nodded. "I'd be honored." Grace smiled, reaching for Walter's hand. "You've brought us closer to a part of our past we thought was lost forever. It's only right that you're here." Emily clapped her hands in delight. "Yay, Mr. Walter is staying." The room filled with laughter and the warmth of newfound family. Walter looked around, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in decades, he felt truly at home. Walter settled into his new life with Grace, David, and Emily, his days filled with a peace he hadn't known in years. Yet, one evening, as the family gathered on the porch, Walter turned to David, his voice tinged with quiet determination. David, he began, I've carried the memories of those days with me for a lifetime. I think it's time I return to where it all happened, to honor your father and the others who didn't make it back. David nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. I've always wanted to visit those places to feel closer to my dad. Let's do it together. Grace smiled, placing a hand on Walter's shoulder. And we'll make sure everything is arranged. The family threw themselves into preparations for the trip. Maps were spread across the dining table. Old war journals were dusted off, and flights were booked. Emily, ever curious, helped by decorating a scrapbook she insisted on bringing. Mr. Walter, she said one afternoon, can I come with you and Grandpa? I want to see the places that were important to Grandpa Jack. Walter smiled, his heart warmed by her enthusiasm. One day, little one. For now, it's a journey for your grandfather and me. But I promise to tell you all about it. When the day finally came, Grace and Emily waved goodbye at the airport as Walter and David embarked on their journey. Their itinerary took them to Normandy, where the beaches still whispered stories of sacrifice, and to Korea, where Walter and Jack had fought. Walter and David stood in quiet reflection at each site, sharing memories and emotions. They met other veterans and their families, trading stories that brought laughter and tears. Together, they placed wreaths at memorials, their hearts heavy yet filled with pride. Sitting under a starry Korean sky one evening, Walter turned to David. Your father gave me a second chance at life. I want you to know that I've tried to live in a way that would make him proud. David, his voice steady, replied, he would be proud, Walter. And I'm proud to call you family. After weeks of travel, Walter and David returned home, their faces brighter, their spirits lighter. Grace and Emily greeted them at the door, their excitement palpable. Grandpa, Mr. Walter, Emily cried, throwing her arms around them. Did you bring back stories? Walter chuckled, lifting her into his arms. We did, little one. And souvenirs too. The family gathered around the dining table that evening as Walter and David shared tales from their journey. David produced a small box he had purchased in Normandy, a replica of a compass used by soldiers during the war. He handed it to Emily. For you, he said, to remind you always to find your way back to family. Emily beamed, clutching the gift tightly. Thank you, Grandpa. Walter pulled out a scrapbook filled with photos from their trip. And this is for you, Grace. So you can see the places where your father made history. Grace flipped through the pages, her eyes brimming with tears. Thank you, Walter. This means more than I can say. As the night went on, the conversation shifted to the future. Grace had an idea that had been growing in her heart since Walter's arrival. Walter, she began, I've been thinking. You've shared so many stories and lessons with us. What if we help you share them with others? So many people could learn from your experiences. Walter tilted his head, intrigued. What do you mean? We could create a community project, Grace explained, where veterans like you can share their stories with schools, libraries, and even online. It would be a way to keep these memories alive. David nodded in agreement. It's a way to honor Jack and everyone else who fought alongside you. Walter's eyes sparkled. I'd like that. I think Jack would like that too. The family worked together over the next few months to launch the project. Walter became a local hero, visiting schools and sharing his stories with young audiences who listened with rapt attention. Emily often joined him, holding up photos and asking questions that brought laughter. The project grew beyond their small town, reaching communities far and wide. Walter's story, and Jack's, touched countless lives, inspiring people to appreciate past sacrifices and build connections in the present. One sunny afternoon, as the family sat together in their garden, Emily looked up at Walter. Mr. Walter, she said, are you happy? Walter smiled, his gaze sweeping over the people who had become his family. Yes, Emily, he said softly. For the first time in a long time, I feel at peace. Grace leaned over, placing her hand over his. We're so glad you're here, Walter. Walter nodded, his heart full. And I'm glad Jack brought me to you. As the sun set, casting a golden glow over the garden, the family sat together, sharing stories and laughter. The journey begun with a delayed flight had led to a new beginning, one filled with love, purpose, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Walter knew that, though Jack was gone, his spirit lived on in every connection they had forged and every story they had shared. This wasn't just the end of a chapter. It was the start of a legacy. It was a reminder for Walter, Grace, David, and Emily that family, whether by blood or choice, is the greatest gift.